Well, good morning, Forest Hills Baptist Church. It's good to be with you today as I stream here from Dayton, Ohio. I'm Paul Norton, I'm the lead pastor here at Faith Baptist Church, and your pastor invited me to be a part of your Missions Month. It's been exciting for me to hear from afar what God has been doing in your all's hearts through this Missions Month. I know it's been a pretty wild month, hasn't it? It started off normal, and now here we are watching TV at home, watching the sermon from home. But I'm glad that in spite of what's going on and the uncertainty that's taking place in the world around us, you're still going forward in your faith as our gospel purpose hasn't changed. I've been encouraged to hear about Dr. Hardy coming to speak there, and about him encouraging you to invest as diligently in eternity as the unsaved do for their temporal existence. It was good to hear a friend of mine was there as well, Nate Bill, reminding you all that the gospel is for everyone from Acts 16. It was also neat to hear another friend was with you last week, Pastor Adam Rivero, great church planter there in the Boston area, speaking about strangers in the land and how when we are strangers in the land, that affects our choices, which includes our finances in giving to missions. So here's my desire for you today. My desire is to try to encourage you about the nitty-gritty of missions. It's how do we give to the gospel? How do we not just give to the gospel, but how do we give in a manner that demonstrates I am a follower of Christ? And then if I do give to the gospel as a follower of Jesus Christ, how can I have confidence that if I get involved at a significant level, that it will really be worth it and it will be the best decision in the long run? Now, sometimes these types of events that are all around us right now come along and they tempt us by the devil and even in the weakness of our own flesh to doubt the need for us to give to the gospel or to doubt its effectiveness in going forward. Sometimes we kind of feel about our gospel giving and our missions giving like I do about an investment I made early on in my life. In my young 20s, I opened a Roth IRA with Edward Jones. And my advisor would call me from time to time, about every 4 to 6 months. His name was Steve. Steve would call me. And the conversation would kind of go a little bit like this. He'd call me, and he'd check in to see how I was doing, how I felt about my account. And it was uncanny, his timing. About the time he would call would be about the time I had checked my statement recently to see how bad it was, see how low it was. And so the conversation would kind of go like this. Steve would call me. You're like, hey, Paul, how you doing? Steve here from Edward Jones. Just wanted to check up with you, see how you were doing, see what you were thinking about the account. And I would usually retort, if you'd call me a different day, maybe I'd answer differently, but today, I wish you were not my Edward Jones advisor. And he'd be like, oh, don't say that, Paul. We'd go back and forth, bantering just about how bad my account was, and that I was always losing money, I was never gaining money, that I was always looking into Scottrade instead of Edward Jones. So we'd go back and forth like this, having a good laugh and having a good time. But in the midst of that conversation about my investments, about my family's investments with him, he would always come back to talking to me about the miracle of compound interest. Compound interest is interest calculated on the initial principal, but also calculated on the interest of previous periods of a deposit or loan. A compound interest can be thought of as interest on interest. It make a deposit grow faster or a loan grow faster in its interest rates more than if it was just calculated on the principal amount alone. The rate at which compound interest accrues depends on the frequency of that compounding. The higher the number of compounding periods, obviously the greater amount of compound interest. This compound interest grows, and that compound growth means interest starts earning interest. Albert Einstein reportedly called it one of the most powerful forces in nature. So consider this. My Edward Jones advisor would always call, try to encourage me, keep putting money in, keep putting money in. Compound interest is the goal. Compound growth is the goal, because when you grow a thing, it will grow things, and it will keep growing things, and your return will add up all that much faster. And so he would always end the conversation with these words: Paul, have patience, have consistency. Have patience, have consistency. And he would tell me that if I'd submit to that financial reality available to me with those two words, that in the end, the return would be worth it. Now this morning, I want you to join me in 2 Corinthians chapter number 9. 2 Corinthians chapter number 9. 2 Corinthians is in the New Testament: Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, Acts, Romans. You'll get into the letters to the Corinthians. I'd also encourage you to Google 2 Corinthians chapter number 9, as that's where we'll be, and you can follow along with me as I read, because we have there Paul writing to the Corinthians describing the idea of investing, not with Edward Jones, but investing with God. And what we want to look at this morning is that investing with God will always beat Edward Jones or anybody else for that matter. So join me, 2 Corinthians chapter number 9. We're going to start reading in verse number 6. 2 Corinthians 9:6, Paul writes, and he says this: "But this I say, he which soweth sparingly shall reap also sparingly. He which soweth bountifully shall reap also bountifully. Every man according as he purposeth in his heart, so let him give, not grudgingly or of necessity, for God loveth a cheerful giver. And God is able to make all grace abound toward you, that ye, always having all sufficiency in all things, may abound to every good work. As it is written, He hath dispersed abroad, He hath given to the poor. His righteousness remaineth forever. Now he that ministereth to the seed to the sower, both minister bread for your food, and multiply your seed sown, and increase the fruits of your righteousness, being enriched in everything to all bountifulness, which causeth through us thanksgiving to God. For the administration of this service not only supplieth the one of the saints, but is also abundant also by many thanksgivings unto God. While by the experiment of this ministration they glorify God for your professed subjection unto the gospel of Christ, and for your liberal distribution unto them, and unto all men, and by their prayer for you, which long after you for the exceeding grace of God in you. Thanks be to God for His unspeakable gift." This morning, I want to encourage us with what Paul has written to the Corinthians. He is addressing the collection being taken for the hurting saints there at Jerusalem. And he started talking about this back in chapter number 8. They were under extreme duress because of the persecution they had experienced due to their allegiance to Jesus Christ. He reminds the Corinth church that they, as a Gentile church, had previously and zealously committed to help in this offering, to help their brothers and sisters, to help that church remain there as a gospel outpost there in Jerusalem. He's told them all this. He reminded them of this in verses 1 through 5. But there's an issue. They've not followed through on it. They were some of the first to be forward about it. They were some of the first to say, "We'll do this, Paul. We'll be a part of gospel mission giving. We'll do this." But they hadn't followed through. So, the Apostle Paul provokes their faith by reminding them of the Macedonians' giving and by telling them that Titus, who loves them, is going to come by to collect the offering they pledged for missions. These Corinthians, they're just normal people. Normal people like you, normal people like me. They had the want to give, but they were struggling. Maybe they were struggling with worry about their own provision. Maybe they are struggling with wanting to do what they want to do with their own money. Maybe they just struggle with the consistency of it. We don't know. Whatever it may be, Paul has some encouragement for struggling givers concerning the gospel. So Paul encourages the Corinthians to allow God's grace to help them give generously for the gospel's sake, knowing He'll take care for them in all things. And catch this for us, Hills. If there was a truth that I could communicate to you today from our passage that I want you to walk away with, be enabled with, be encouraged by, it'd be this. As recipients of God's generosity and grace, let us invest towards the gospel in like manner. As recipients of God's generosity and grace, let us invest towards the gospel in like manner. So this morning, as we talk about investing with God, that it's going to beat Edward Jones or any other financial institution every time, as we invest with God, the first truth I want you to remember is this: your yield will be tied to what you invest in and how you invest in it. Your yield will be tied to what you invest in and how you invest in it. Here in verse 6, he starts off by summarizing the benefits of their liberality. And what I mean by that is how they give, that will determine what they get. In verse number 6, what did he say? But this I say then, he which showeth sparingly shall reap also sparingly, and he which showeth bountifully shall reap also bountifully. Paul here is speaking of a universal law he'd already discussed, though in a different application, with the church at Galatia, where we know he talked about, what you sow, you shall also reap. But he's also echoing Jesus' words from Luke's gospel, where he said, give, and it shall be given. Paul here is saying your yield will be tied to what you invest in and how you invest in it. And he reminds us right off the bat that everyone is planting for a harvest. Or maybe updated terminology might be this: we are all investing in different markets. Paul evokes an agricultural picture to illustrate what is taking place with the gospel offering for Jerusalem. He pictures the need in Jerusalem as a field, their money as the seed, and the offering as a harvest opportunity. And by doing so, he helps bring to the forefront of their minds that everyone is investing somewhere. You're broadcasting, you are sowing, you will reap. There will be an expected end result. Nobody escapes the universal reality of sowing and reaping. It's not like there's some third-party option out there or some other default position to go to. You're either sowing towards non-eternal priorities with unbiblical principles as the focus of your life and your investments and your finances, or you're sowing towards eternal priorities based upon biblical principles. Now, it's important we just stop and say, it's not wrong to use your resources to provide for your needs and maybe even some of your wants. That's not wrong. It's not forbidden by God as we read His Word. But Paul wanted them, and he wants us to remember that you're involved in investing for the temporal or the eternal at a significant amount. Nobody is escaping that reality. And so he called them to invest in the marketplace of eternity. So if we do that, or maybe we're already involved in investing in the marketplace of eternity, how should I give? Well, Paul says we're all sowing and reaping in some capacity. We're all investing in some kind of field. So how does God want us to invest our funds that He's granted us to steward towards the gospel? How does He want you and I to do towards missions? Look at verse 7. Every man, according as he purposeth in his heart, so let him give, not grudgingly or of necessity, for God loveth a cheerful giver. Friends, good news. Paul says God gives you great liberty in giving. He wasn't forcing the Corinthians' hand. Now, I want to take a moment, if I could, and lay out what I believe we see in this passage that will help us dispel superstition, dispel frustration, dispel an amount of maybe false guilt we experience when it comes to this issue of giving. Often when it comes to giving, we're looking for someone to tell us just the precise amount, the mark to hit, to know that we've done enough, as it were. Or maybe we've heard a well-meaning pastor or Bible teacher tell us that we're to pray for a certain number. And if we'll just pray for this number, God will hear our prayer, He'll answer our prayer, and He'll give us that number so then we can know what to give and how to give. I would just call us back to this verse if we could and see that Paul outlines here how to give in a very helpful and simple manner. He said, every man as he purposeth in his heart. The idea of this word purpose is making a choice. You're deciding beforehand. It's your preference. It's what you desire to do. You see, giving, we understand, is ultimately to be an issue settled in the privacy of one's own heart. And Paul is saying that God has given them great freedom of choice in regard to the material wealth they possess. They are free to choose what to do with their money. Paul says that giving is to be an intentional decision, not settled lightly or done impulsively. Friends, catch it this morning as we're talking about investing with God. He has given you great liberty in how you do so. And once we've decided on the amount to give and be involved in investing to eternity, let's put our faith into action. Know what he says. Every man has the purpose in his heart, so let him give. This requires the choice of self-denial and the exercising of our faith. In their context, it seemed to be a one-time occasion for the Corinthians, but it's often more frequently for us. Maybe it's every week. Maybe it's twice a month. Maybe it's once a month. I don't know what it looks like for you, but here's what I want to encourage you. Keep purposing in your heart each week, each month, each year that I'm going to deny self and I will act on my faith and I will give. Now, how should I give? Well, it gives two options. You give sparingly. The idea is being meager, being stingy. Now, in regards to the gospel, the idea of this kind of giving, it shows that we have a narcissistic focus. But then he says you don't have to be trapped there. You can give bountifully. It's the gift given to enrich the recipient. The idea or context has a selfless focus. So God gives us great liberty to give. And he says you can choose to give sparingly. That's narcissistic and not faith. Or you can give bountifully for the betterment of those that God desires to reach and work in their lives. And when we give, friends, we have the opportunity to either please God or not. What does he say here in verse number 7 at the end? He wants us to give bountifully, not sparingly, but he says, don't give grudgingly or out of necessity, for God loveth a cheerful giver. God is not interested, nor does it delight him, nor does it please him when one of his children gives grudgingly. Now, the word grudgingly has this idea. We're giving from a position or a place of regret. We're giving in an unhappy manner. We're giving with grief in our hearts because of what we are about to do. God doesn't want that. He wants us not to give out of necessity. The idea there is pressure due to being required, or you're giving out of compulsion. You feel forced or trapped into this position. Paul paints a verbal picture he'd rather not see in real life with the Corinthians or any Christian at all. And that is Christians in a church giving because they have to, not because they want to. Why does he not desire that? Because God loves a cheerful giver. Think about that. God has strong affection stirred towards those who are happy to give. It delights his heart when we give cheerfully. Now, to give cheerfully requires that you would give by faith. And we know from Hebrews 11 what pleases God? Faith. So, my friends, God's given us this great liberality to give. And he's saying, give with a want to, not just a have to. See, often I fear I'm eager to invest bountifully in what's desirable, what's convenient for me. I'm ready to get involved there and be sparingly towards God and His economy. And there's a real struggle there. There's a struggle inside of each of us. We all face it. We feel the pull to be invested in temporal matters. Like, I'm going to invest largely, not sparingly, bountifully in my mortgage or in my IRA or in my hours at work or in a boat or in a hobby, whatever it might be for you or me. But then sometimes, if we're not careful, we'll get into the temptation and give into the temptation to be meager towards the gospel through giving, going, and serving. And Paul starts off by saying, our yield will be tied to what we invest in and how we invest in it. But secondly, as we invest with God, let us remember, He makes your investment potential greater than your actual ability. Somebody could step back here and say, well, he seems to be demanding quite a bit from the Corinthians, and maybe things have changed in their circumstances, and he doesn't know that, and so he maybe needs to lay off a little. Maybe Titus doesn't need to be as firm with the money they pledged to give a year ago. Well, Paul links why they should give to how they'll be able to give and how others poorer than them socioeconomically have given as well. What does he link it to in verse number 8? And God is able to make all grace abound towards you. You see, as we think of this idea of investing with God, God has promised you, He has promised me to make our investment potential greater than our actual perceived ability. God is able to enable you. These affluent Corinthians struggled with giving. How could their hearts that were struggling be changed? I don't know you personally, but maybe today you struggle with this idea of giving. You look at the bills and they're tight, or you look at your commitments and you're not just sure. Or maybe you have an unstable job future. I don't know what it might be. And you may say, how can God change me from not wanting to give to being willing to give? And not just willing, but be a cheerful giver. How can God change this heart of mine? I want it. How does it happen? What does verse 8 say? God is able to make all grace abound towards you. Think about grace. We know it often as the unmerited favor of God. We often know it about His ability to accomplish spiritually that which we're unable to do. If we're just trying to get into a very simplistic idea of what does grace do? Grace is God's enablement or God's help. For the Corinthians or anyone else who had struggled to give, Paul is telling them, he's telling us there's hope and there is help from God. That not only will accomplish His desire alone in this matter, but can and will accomplish His other desires through us. Note what he says here. God is able to make all grace abound towards you, that ye always having all sufficiency in all things. Pretty broad, right? All things may abound to every good work. See, this is why it has to be grace that enables us to give. We doubt it. We struggle with our own sinful flesh. We look at the circumstances. We see the bank account numbers. We see issues and problems. But God has enough grace to change all that and battle back my sinful flesh decision by decision, time after time. My friends, I want to encourage you today that if you say, I want to be a giver, I want to be a giver like my God's a giver, I want to be a cheerful giver, let's remember how God does that. He does it by His grace. And maybe we step back, and maybe the Corinthians would step back and say, okay, but what about everything else? If He'll help change my heart to give, what about the rest of everything? I mean, I'm still going to have needs, right? Well, Paul addresses that. Verse 9, as it is written, he quotes here Psalm 112:9, He hath dispersed abroad, He hath given to the poor. His righteousness remaineth forever. Now, He which ministereth seed to the sower, both minister bread for your food, and multiply your seed sown, and increase the fruits of your righteousness. Paul says God cares for your physical needs too. Whether or not they were concerned about persecution of eventually coming to them and afflicting them like it was the church there at Jerusalem and affecting their material well-being, or whether they're just being materialistic. We don't know, but we do know they were struggling. Paul reminds them of God's care for their needs by quoting Psalm 112:9. He again returns to the farmer broadcasting seed without abandon, knowing it would produce a greater harvest. His generosity would bring about a benefit for himself. And in verse number 10, Paul reminds him that the same God who supplies the seed for the farmer also utilized him to give food for them as Corinthians. So in like manner, catch it what he's saying about their financial giving there for the church at Jerusalem. In like manner, God will take their intentional offerings, enabled by His grace, with the money He has provided them, and utilize in great ways their gift to provide for the saints there at Jerusalem. And as the generous farmer sowed and received a greater harvest, Paul is saying God will produce a greater harvest through their generous giving. He has all the grace we need to accomplish His work in and through us. And He has then said, and I will care for your necessities as well. Now, did you catch that? Necessities. We in America, we often, as Americans, mix the line of necessity and wants. But God is faithful. He will care for your needs, and He will care for your soul as you go through it. What does He say in verse 11? Being enriched in everything to all bountifulness, which causeth through us thanksgiving to God. He's saying as the Corinthians would get on board with God's grace-based giving plan, they would realize just how wealthy they are in this issue of grace in every other area of their lives. As they said yes to God in that area and no to doubt, and God began working in their heart and in their lives, and they saw His grace work and change them, they would realize just how rich they are in their Savior and what He is able to do, and it would abound in what? Thanksgiving. Instead of being in some level of doubt and pride about giving and God's ability, they would find Him sufficient and more than enough. And that would turn their hearts to seeing it in every other spectrum and grow thankfulness to their God in their lives. And so the Corinthians were called to enjoy greater opportunities than they sought, and they were able to find God work in ways they couldn't imagine. But isn't that what grace is always about, right? I mean, you think about it. Pause for a second there. I don't know who you're watching with this morning, but just look around the room with you and consider what grace has accomplished in your life and in the lives of those that you know and you love. Consider your current condition. Consider your everyday spiritual struggle. Consider even this issue of giving when circumstances aren't ideal. Look around the room and be reminded, God has been gracious and merciful to me over and over and over again. He's been more than enough when I could never have had the ability on my own. Just to kind of drive that point home, think about it and go back and read later 2 Corinthians chapter 8, verses 1 through 5, where Paul highlights the other believers there that were impoverished. They were poor as could be, but gave sacrificially, gave to even their own detriment so that the Jerusalem church could remain and a gospel witness would remain intact there in that persecuted area. You see, grace does in our lives what we are unable to do. It moves us beyond our limited ability to find God's ability. Our potential goes from small in scope to potentially and exponentially greater. And so, Paul says to them, multiply this in your heart. And then Corinthian church, start thinking about each other and realizing how this will begin to multiply with you. It's not just addition, it's multiplication. Multiply this reality by each Christian and each church and consider just what kind of impact can be done with gospel giving with Christians and churches and churches and churches. Maybe a way to illustrate would be this. My wife and I had the privilege to go out and take a church that was about to close down in California. And when we did so, several churches were very generous and very gracious in their giving towards us to be able to be a part of that restoration or revitalization project. So one church invested $10,000 over a 3-year period. Another church invested $30,000 over a 3-year period. So get the idea here. We've had, over the span of 3 years, $45,000 with some other churches invested into the church to help us be able to be going forward on revitalizing it. But here's what started happening year one. We began teaching those who were with us about the grace of God and how it changed us, even in this area of giving. And as they got on board and grew in grace, and we saw other people saved or added to church, and they grew in grace and started giving to missions, over a span of 6 years, this smaller church out in California gave over $125,000 to the mission program for the gospel to go forward. Now, I want you to back up and think about that. Churches were willing to take us on and help us out as a church revitalization project for about $45,000 and over a 3-year period. But within 6 years, the church had already given 3 times that amount back to missions. You see, my friends, grace makes it possible. Consider right where you're at there at Forest Hills. Churches have partnered to help you all establish another good gospel work in that area. And as a church, if everybody gave graciously, and let's say that only amounted to $100 a week for the first year, well, what'd you have? You'd have over $5,000. What if they did it for the second year, but you upped it to $200 a week of missions giving? Well, what do you have? Double. And what if you had that up to $300 a week in the third year? I know you guys are in your 5 years of existence, but in just 3 years, you all would have given over $30,000 back to gospel missions if all there was come in was $100 a week corporately, $200, then $300. You see, in each scenario, you've not only compounded the initial investment into you for the gospel, but you've also, if we can say it in the business world, created new revenue streams by taking on missionaries and helping new church plants get established. You see, God takes your initial investment potential or ability and always makes it greater than anything you and I could do in and of ourselves. And so he tells these Corinthians, hey, get on board with the grace of God in your giving. So as we invest with God, your yield will be tied to what you invest in and how you invest in it. God then makes your investment potential greater than your actual ability. And lastly, this morning, as we invest with God, the guaranteed return on your investment is that God will be glorified. Now, stop and pause and think about what I just said. The guaranteed return on your investment. That's something that no brokerage can offer you, a guaranteed investment. But when you partner with God, there's always a guaranteed investment return. And it is this, that He is glorified. What does he say here in verse number 12? For the administration of this service of giving by grace for the gospel to go forward, not only supplieth the one of the saints, but is abundant also by many thanksgiving unto God. When we give, the immediate return on investment for the glory of God is that He is seen in our hearts and the hearts of others as the provider and caretaker of His children. Paul states that this ministry of the church at Corinth, as well as the other Gentile churches, not only would provide for the gospel presence to continue there in Jerusalem, but also become the basis for giving thanks to God. Thus, believers would look to God for His care, and they would rejoice over His work that He was accomplishing in their lives. He would receive the rightful worship and glory He was worthy of. So when we think about a return on investment, it elevates God as our provider and caretaker, but then His glory is seen in that He rules in our realm of our choices. What does he go on to say in verse 13? whilst by the experiment of this ministration, they glorify God, catch the wording, for your professed subjection unto the gospel of Christ, and for your liberal distribution unto them and unto all men. God's glory is seen in that He rules in our lives. Paul here talks about them having a subjection to the gospel. As they gave place to get rid of doubt and embrace what Paul was reminding them of, to embrace in faith, and God's grace worked in their life. It began changing them, shaping them, molding them. His rule would be seen in their life in what we would say is an unnatural way. By default, we always seek our betterment. Our sin nature within us always wants to do what is convenient for us, what is best for us. And even if we at some level want to be charitable or generous, it's still at a level that doesn't encroach upon me and mine and my wants, plans, desires, etc. But Paul said God was being elevated. God was getting glory. The return on investment from you giving by grace would be that as this offering goes forward, they would see that what you have professed to be as a follower of Christ, that it is actually seen in the possession of His rule going forward in your lives. And he says that they would be in subjection to the gospel, that being their prioritization in life, and everything else falling under that heading. It said that they would even give liberally for others. Now, liberal giving for others would mean they would have to have it at the expense of themselves, rather than meager giving for others for the enjoyment of themselves. You see, when we give generously beyond human desire, it shows that we have submitted ourselves to somebody else's authority, somebody else's rule, somebody else's reign, and somebody else's economy. Paul said, Corinthians, if you will give with the grace of God for your brothers and sisters there in Jerusalem, that the church can continue its gospel initiative there, its gospel focus there, its gospel outreach there, God gets glory. There is a return on investment, and He is seen as the ruler of your lives, and it becomes a witnessing opportunity for those around you that He does rule, not just in word, but in life as well. What does that do? It strengthens other believers' faith. It tells them that God's grace is reliable. It's someone they can depend on, something they can have themselves. 14, what does Paul say? Verse 14. And by their prayer for you, the saints at Jerusalem, which long after you for the exceeding grace of God in you. Paul is making an assumption that the recipients of their offering will respond with thanks to God and intercessory prayers for them back to God. They will recognize that the grace manifested in their giving comes from an unsurpassing grace of God that's working in their life to do what they would never do of themselves. And in difficult times, they'll look to God for His grace as well. What's Paul saying? The saints of Jerusalem, they will be changed, they will be challenged by what they've heard and seen from your example of grace. Not because you did it, because that's not what grace is. Not because you mustered it up, but because what God did in and through your heart, there's only one person who gets the glory, Him. And it shows them, these are my brothers and sisters. We're all in this together. And if God has done this in their life with His grace, He must be able and willing to do it in my life as well. My friends, I would just encourage you, the choices you're making today as an individual, as a family, and as a church family, they affect others in a good way. One person said it like this: our choices of faith always affect others. Enthusiasm is the best protection in any situation, and wholeheartedness is contagious. When you give with the grace of God, it makes a difference. God is elevated. He receives His glory. But my friends, it challenges and encourages other brothers and sisters to grow as well. And so Paul ends this section by saying God receives glory. The for sure return on investment is that we see the glory of God go forward by us being humbled by the indescribable gift that Jesus is to us. What does he say here in verse number 15? Thanks be unto God for His unspeakable gift. Now, while there's some disagreement about what the gift could be, maybe Paul's talking about their financial offering, maybe he's talking about the abundance of the grace of God, maybe he's talking about some particular aspect of salvation. It could be those, as there's disagreement about it, but it seems likely that it's in overarching reference to who Jesus is and what He's done on our behalf. We could go back to chapter 8, verse 9, as it's speaking about Christ. It says, for you know the grace of our Lord Jesus Christ, that though He was yet rich, yet for your sakes He became poor, that ye, through His poverty, might be rich. What did Jesus do for us? We know He was willing to condescend to live among us. God became flesh and walked with His rebellious creation. Beyond that, He didn't just live with us, He was murdered by us. He died for your sin, for my sin, for those who drove the nails, and for you and I who just read about it. He died for sinners. But we know He didn't stay dead. We're coming up on Easter, however that's going to look like in the middle of all this. We know that He is risen. And due to His person and work, we now have the privilege to what? Not only be adopted, not only know that eternity is our home, but you and I get to enjoy right now the privilege of living in grace. You see, all of that we experience as being a child of God, all that we have that He shared with us in salvation, all of that brings God glory. You see, when we avail ourselves to God's grace in any area, but particularly what we're talking about today, giving for the gospel to go forward. When we do that, God's seen in our lives. He's reflected. That's the idea of glory. He's reflected. He's seen through our lives. Could we maybe just flip this around for a second to think? Sometimes at church, when we have an offering, or if you do it online, whatever you do there, and that plate comes by, sometimes we give habitually, and that's not wrong and bad of itself. Sometimes we're concerned about it passing by. God can help us with that. But can I flip it on its head and say this? Every time you write a check for missions, every time you give online, I want you to think about this. God in that moment is being rightly exalted in your life. Right there in that moment, He's being seen more clearly to others. He is being reflected through your life. Now, I'm a bit of a glass is half empty, throw it on the floor kind of guy, so I can't help but read Paul's statement here and say, but what if the whole thing falls apart, Paul? You know, you're telling me give by grace, God will give glory, He'll get glory from that. I should give cheerfully, I should give generously. But we have been in church long enough, perhaps, to see that not all churches succeed. Sometimes they shut down. Sometimes missionaries come back from the field. Sometimes church plants become church flops. What do we do then? Is God still glorified then, Paul? Is it really worth it to give graciously then? Let me challenge you. Even if a church plant fails, even if a missionary has to come back from the field, even if a church shuts its door, none of these are scenarios we desire nor would we delight in, but let's say it did. I want to challenge you to look at it like this. There has still been a return on that investment. You say, well, how could you say that? Something shut down. Well, did the givers that enabled that work to go forward in different churches then banding together in cooperation, did those people grow in faith? God was glorified. There was a return on investment. Did people along the way in churches that they heard about missions and missions giving and their faith was encouraged and built up? Was there a return on investment there? There was. Maybe we go further than that. Let's say that church planter did get there, that missionary did get there, and they started talking to people, and at least one person got saved. Was there a return on investment? Yeah, there was. You see, my friends, when Paul says there is always a return on investment when we give to the glory of God, when we give with His grace, He does receive His glory, and therefore there is always a return, even when in our realm we think maybe it's not, or something has changed, challenged, or flopped. It doesn't matter. When we have given in an eternal manner with the grace of God, there has been a return on investment that God received His rightful glory ruling in our lives. So today, we've learned that when you invest with God, your yield will be tied to what you invest in and how you invest in it. God makes your investment potential greater than your actual ability, and the guaranteed return on your investment is that God is glorified. So you might step back and say, then why are we watching you today? Why did our pastor ask you to speak to us as Forest Hills? Well, if I could go back to my intro and maybe simply put it, it's like this. I'm the Edward Jones guy. I'm here to get your money. Or maybe if we're talking about Paul's context here, I'm Titus. I'm here to collect the offering. But unlike Edward Jones, I'm asking you to invest in something that you can't lose money in. Even if it fails, you have still gained. So what do you need to do today as a member or an attender of Forest Hills? Each child, each teenager, each man or woman, and each couple can ask themselves this: am I investing with God? Or am I in the sparing category? Am I bountifully with my life and meager over here? We're all investing somewhere, friend. Let's start with that question. Am I investing with God? After asking and answering that, let's ask this. Am I giving in a manner that demands God's grace in my life? I'm not talking about comfortable giving here. I'm not talking about convenient giving here. I'm talking about sacrificial giving that demands you deny yourself. I'm talking about missions giving in a way that changes your weekly routine. That type of giving calls us to rely upon grace as our flesh would naturally rebel against it. Last question. Will I be open and accountable to help it continue? Let's say today, I make the decision. I want to be on board with giving to missions. I want to give graciously. I want to give sacrificially. I want to deny self. Today, I'm making that decision of faith. I'm going to go forward. Wonderful. I'm thrilled for you. I look forward to hearing how God uses your missions giving there at Forest Hills to produce wonderful church plants and mission work endeavors. But here's what I'm challenging you to do. Have somebody you speak about it with, you share it with, you encourage one another about it. Maybe once a week, maybe in the months to come after your missions month. I don't know when that will be for you, but don't let the devil try to undo what God worked in this month in your heart to do in faith, enabled by His grace. So this morning, as recipients of God's generosity and grace, let us invest towards the gospel in like manner. I'm calling you today, invest with God. It'll be Edward Jones every time. It'll be Charles Schwab every time. It'll be Scottrade, E-Trade every single time. It'll be Vanguard. You today, my friends, invest with God as His child, enabled by His grace, going forward in what He wants to accomplish. I'm thankful for the opportunity today. I look forward to hearing what God does in your lives in the future to come. God bless.